FreeCAD has some amazing features, but it often lags behind what other paid, closed-source CAD programs can do. One of the killer features of, say, Fusion 360 is the ability to do lofts and sweeps with guide rails. That lets you create curved and organic shapes with little effort. Sadly, FreeCAD does not support guide rails out of the box, but we can still make organic shapes using basic lofts. It just requires more effort. I'll also show you how to use other workbenches, aka plugins, to make the process easier. Let's dive in. We looked at lofts briefly in the previous video. This time, we'll use them with B-splines to create organic shapes, as well as install a plugin that allows us to use guide rails. A spline is a mathematical function used to define a curve of any shape and size using piecewise polynomials. There are a number of ways to define such a curve, and one popular method is the basis spline, or B-spline. In many computer graphics and CAD programs, splines can be constructed using a set of B-splines. If you've ever made an arbitrary curve in a graphics program by manipulating endpoints and knots, then you've created a spline using either B-splines or Bezier curves. The FreeCAD Wiki has a fantastic article describing B-splines if you want to dive into the math behind them. 3D Benchy, or often just Benchy, is a model designed in 2015 by Creative Tools for the express purpose of testing 3D printers. Many 3D printing enthusiasts love to demonstrate their printer's capabilities by making a Benchy with different features. That being said, boat hulls are a great example of an organic shape that requires splines to model. We'll make our own using splines and lofts. I'm not a boat designer by any stretch of the imagination, so this is just a learning exercise and maybe a toy if you want to print it. As with anything in part design, we're going to first create a new document, and then we're going to create a new body to work under to create our boat hull. First, we're going to create a sketch, and we're going to put it on the XZ plane. We're going to define the stern of the boat, or the aft section. We're going to then define the bow, the front. We're going to define basically a set of ribbings, and then to do that, we're going to create what the shape of the boat, the outline is on the XY plane, and then the shape on the YZ plane, and we're going to create the ribbings to follow those guidelines for us. We're going to do this manually first, and then I'm going to show you how to do it with a third-party add-on that allows us to use guide rails. It makes this process much easier. To begin, let's start sketching on the XZ plane. We're going to pick the B-spline tool, and we're going to start with this x-axis here. So I want it attached to this. I'm going to come out. I'm going to define something like this. And then I'm going to come in here and attach it to the Z-axis. Right-click to end that tool. Adjust my camera. And once we have that, we can manipulate these B-splines to create the shape of the stern of the boat. What I like to do, because I'm going to mirror this across here, I like to set a horizontal constraint between this knot and this end point, and that makes it curve nicely without coming to a point. I'm not going to do the same up here because I don't mind that kind of shape. And I am going to define a general width and height of this, but I'm not going to set dimensions for this just for the sake of time. So with the Smart Dimension tool, let's set half the width of the top of our boat to be 10 millimeters. And that looks a little funky, so let's bring these endpoints in. We're going to adjust these in a minute. I'm going to hit D to use our dimension tool again. Let's define this height. I want this to be, I don't know, about 15 millimeters. Ooh, that looks fun. So I'm going to bring in these knots, like so. And then you want to adjust these to the shape that you desire for your boat. And let me bring these in. I'm going to bring this back out so that that is nice and curved. And I'm just going to keep playing with these knots and endpoints to get the B-spline in the shape that I want. And let's see. Let's bring this knot up here. I want it to be a little bit thicker down here. And I know nothing about boat design, so I'm just making this up as I go. So if you know more about boat design, please feel free to design an actual boat hull. But for now, this is just a fun shape because we're making a toy boat, so it doesn't actually have to work very well. Bring this knot out. There we go. That looks pretty good. I want to make this a little bit wider. Like so. Let's bring this endpoint up. You notice I'm just kind of playing with the spline points here. Hey, that looks pretty good. And then you can imagine this being extruded out from this plane, and it gives us a decent shape to work with. I'm going to bring this out. Yeah, there we go. Let's bring this in. Yeah, that's the curved shape I want. That looks good enough. Let's go ahead and highlight it. We're going to mirror this across the z-axis here. And then to get this to work as a ribbing, we need to connect these points. So let's use the line tool and connect this point to this point. If you don't do this, you'll find that FreeCAD will yell at you when we go to do the Loft tool. So right-click to end that tool. You can actually set constraints for these. So if you wanted to set a distance between, say, this knot and this line here, this axis, you can absolutely do this. They treat these as points as with any point in a sketch in FreeCAD. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to fully define those or constrain those. So I'm just going to click close. And I'm going to set the position of this sketch to be away from the front here because this is the back of the boat. And I'm thinking I kind of want the middle of the boat at this origin point. So let's go to sketch. Notice that these positions are relative to the sketch. So Z is actually normal to the sketch plane, not the absolute Z axis, which is a little bit confusing, but you can just play with these values to see how the sketch moves. So you notice if I try to move it along X, it actually moves it along that X axis, which is fine, but then Y doesn't move it along the Y axis, it moves it along this absolute Z axis. So I'm going to set these back to 0, and I'm going to move it normal along the sketch plane, which this considers the relative Z axis. So minus 25 millimeters. That looks good. I think the boat's going to be something like 50 millimeters. So we'll sweep this around here. I'm going to create another sketch on the XZ plane again. And this time I'm going to make this small semicircle. So I'm going to use this arc tool, arc by 3 points. So I'm going to click 1 point, another point, and then define how this arc is created. Basically this radius, right click to end the tool. I want to make the center point of this arc coincident with the origin. And now I can adjust the radius. I'm going to set this radius to something very small. I want this to approximate a point because what I found is that the Loft tools don't really work well with points. You need to set something like an actual shape, a circle or a square or something. So I'm going to use a semicircle here just to create a basic shape, and it's going to be a very small semicircle, and that's going to approximate something like a point for us when we go to use the Loft tool. And don't forget to close off this sketch like so. This one is fully defined, so we'll say close that. And then I'm going to position this sketch in the positive 25 millimeters. So that's now over here, if you can see that sketch here, and we're going to sweep the boat along this way. Or sweep the hull, rather. I'm going to rename these sketches. So this first one, I'm going to rename to hull_stern. I'm going to rename this front piece to hull_bow. So now we have those named. Let's create another sketch on the XY plane. And now we get to define the rails for our boat like this. And these will just be used as guidelines for us when we create the manual ribbing, and then we'll actually use them as guide rails for the third-party tool. We're going to create another B-spline. But before we do that, we actually want to bring in some stuff as external geometry. Let's bring in this top line from the stern, and we're going to bring in this top line from the bow. Right-click to end that tool. Let's go to the B-splines tool, and we're going to create few points here. I'm just clicking to set these. Right click to end that. Let's zoom out. And that's not going to get me what I want, actually. So if I create this, bring this way, and it's not quite the shape because it's too curved there. I'm going to click that and delete it. Let's give it one more point to work with. Actually, let me go back. I'm going to show you how you can add a point. So if you right-click this here, you can insert a knot and click, and we have just added it. We can modify the B-splines rather than having to start from scratch, which I very much enjoy. So as I mentioned, we're going to create a horizontal constraint between this knot and this endpoint. So it creates this nice curve. I'm going to bring this in because we want this boat to be somewhat pointy. You know, it's not quite a speedboat. It's going to be more like a tugboat, like benchy. And let's move these knots around to create something like, I think that looks pretty good. I can bring this out a little bit. Like I said, more of a tugboat. And bring that in. There we go. I'm not a ship designer, but we're going to call this good enough. And we're going to highlight this, highlight the B-spline we just created, and we are going to mirror it across this y-axis. Feel free to fully constrain this, but this is all we need for guide rails right now. So let's close out of this. And we are going to rename this to hull_XY. That is our guide rails in the XY plane. So you can see this boat coming together, the shape at least. Then we are going to define our guide rails on the YZ plane. So we're going to fully define this 3D shape. So start a new sketch, click YZ plane. As we did before, we want to bring in these bow and stern sketches as external geometry. Gives us something to work with. Right-click to end that tool. And then I'm going to create a B-spline to connect the bottom of this sketch. I'm going to do the normal thing where it should be rounded. So we're going to add a knot there. We're going to create one here. And then we're going to end, I don't know, somewhere about here. Right-click to end that tool. Right-click again. So you right-click first to stop the B-spline. Right-click again to end the tool. And we're going to create a line, really basic line to end this. Notice the horizontal constraint that's been added. This is not tangent, so we want this nice curve here. So I'm going to use the tangent tool, click the B-spline, and then click the line. That's fine. It updates the coincident constraint to be a tangent constraint, which we see here, and now it creates this nice smooth transition from the B-spline into that horizontal line. Right-click to end that tool, and I'm not super happy with this shape, so I'm going to move these knots around. Whoops, we need to create a vertical constraint, so press V between this endpoint and this knot. That creates that nice sweep and curve here. Feel free to move this around depending on how you want your boat to look. I'm going to make it kind of tugboat-y. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. Feel free to constrain these. In fact, I'll demonstrate that here. Let's set a constraint between this point and this point. It's a horizontal constraint. We'll set it to 4 millimeters. And I'm going to do between this and the axis. Let's set that, I don't know, where were we? 25. And it's a little more rounded than I like. Let's try 20. There we go. That looks pretty good. Or 22. Ooh, I like that. And then let's do a distance for here. We'll set this to 22. Let's right-click to end that, and I think this looks pretty good. Close out of this sketch, and you can see we have this shape for the guidelines of our boat. Next, we're going to start creating our ribbing, and to make this easier, we're actually going to start with the stern sketch. We're going to press Control-C to bring up this copy menu. Remember to deselect all. We did this in the previous episode. And just select our stern sketch. Click OK. You can press Control-V to paste it. Notice it's outside of the body. So I'm going to drag this sketch inside the body, and it appears here with the rest of my sketches. Let's change this Z to something like -3. That should put it near this wide point on our rails, which is what we want because we're going to define this curve coming into the boat here. So double click to edit that sketch. And I'm going to rotate my camera a little bit. The first thing I want to do is delete this B-spline. I'm going to bring this point in so we can see what to do with that later. And then I'm actually going to move this B-spline out, but I have to delete this constraint to do that. So I'm going to move it out so that it touches as close as possible to this guide rail. There's no easy way to connect a sketch on a different plane in the part design or sketcher. There's another workbench that allows you to do that. It's a third-party workbench, and it's not nearly as intuitive as this one. But for now, we can get it close enough, and it's good enough for something like this organic shape. So let's go to front, and I'm going to bring these knots out to maintain that nice boat look. So something like that. And this top point, or this top line, should still be connected. I think that looks pretty good. So let's highlight that B-spline. We're going to mirror it around this axis. And then we're going to use the coincident constraint to connect that top line to this top point of the B-spline here. Right click. And we are done. So close out of that. So we've got our first ribbing that's in the middle of the boat. And we need to create another one. So let's copy the stern again. Control C. Deselect all, select whole stern, click OK, Control V to paste it outside the body, drag that sketch into the body, and then let's move that sketch somewhere up here on the boat. Let's make that 10 millimeters. Hey, that looks pretty good. So we're going to have to start defining more of these as we get to the front of the boat here. Double click to edit that sketch. As we did before, let's remove this right-hand B-spline. And we want to match this up by first removing that constraint, that horizontal distance constraint, and move it to line up with our guide rail here. And we need to do the same with the guide rail along the YZ plane. So come in and move these up. You can grab these, move these up. Oops, let's get rid of this vertical constraint. So highlight that vertical constraint. And we can move this up so it lines up with that. Now, the thing I want to do is actually make sure that this is coincident with the Z-axis here. So I'm going to use C to bring up this coincident constraint tool. Click on that endpoint, click on the line. So now it's attached to that line. And then I'm going to rotate the camera again. And I want to bring this up so it's more or less in line with that YZ guide rail. Go back to front, and now we fix the design of this. We want to make it a little bit smaller because the bow is starting to come in a little bit. Oh, notice when I move that endpoint, that starts to move as well. Let's bring this up. We can bring this endpoint, and let's keep that shape. It's a little bit bigger than, or actually it needs to be a little bit smaller than the stern. Just going to move these endpoints around till I get a shape that I like. These should still be horizontally constrained. And I'm just going to keep moving these around. You can constrain them if you wish. Let's bring this down. That looks good. And I'm going to rotate the camera, make sure that this is in line with that guide rail. And I don't like this super sharp curve here, so I'm just going to bring this down like that. I'm going to bring this one in a little bit, like so. That looks pretty good. Okay, so like we did before, I'm going to highlight, or I'm going to click on that B-spline. Let's mirror it about the Z-axis. And then I'm going to connect these 2 points here, this top line, with that new B-spline, because those have got to be connected. Oof, notice that it brought that in, which means we need to bring this out to line up with that guide rail, just like we have on this one. I'm going to bring this in just a little bit. And I am worried that this is no longer symmetrical, and that bugs me. So I'm actually going to Control Z, and I'm going to redraw this line. So these two should be symmetrical. Let's redraw this line across the top. So let's start here. Let's go to this point here, right-click to end that tool, view front. That spline looks pretty good. So we can close out and see how this shape is coming with those ribs. I think that's coming along nicely. We're going to repeat this process. And let's start, instead of with the whole stern, since we're getting smaller, let's start with this one. So Control C to copy it, deselect all, just select the sketch that we're wanting to copy. Click OK, and either right-click and say paste, or Control V. Notice it's not in line with the body because it's outside of the body. Drag this inside the body somewhere. It shows up here. Double-click to edit it. Well, actually, before we do that, let's go to placement, and we want to bring this out towards the bow even more. Placement actually doesn't work very well. That's absolute. That's a little tough to work with. I prefer attachment where this goes. So instead of 10 millimeters, we're going to go with 20. So now it's getting even closer to the front. So double-click to edit that. We're going to remove this top line. And I'm going to bring this in like so, so it connects there. I'm going to bring these up and in, make this a little bit smaller. And while I'm working on that, I'm going to delete this right B-spline. And let's just bring everything up and make it smaller. And feel free to hide the other ribs that we've been working with, because that can create a little bit of confusion. We do want that YZ, which is there. In fact, I should come back and rename that as soon as we're done with this. And make sure we line up with that one there. And then once again, go to front and move these around to get a shape that you like. I'm going to move this up. Move this one down. Let's bring back in the previous sketch so we can see what that one looked like, and we're going to try to replicate that shape a little bit. So you just keep moving these around. Bring this in. We're going to bring these down. Bring this one out just a little bit. And there we go. It's not too bad. Something like that. So we're going to click on that one. We're going to mirror it. Oops, does not like that. Let's highlight mirror across that point. And we are going to connect the line that goes between them here to there. Let's rotate, make sure we're still more or less lined up with these guide rails. That looks pretty good. I can actually bring these in a little bit if I wanted to, but I think that's fine. So we're going to say close. That looks pretty good. And I mentioned I want to rename this. So let's rename this part here to hull _ YZ, because that is our guide rail on the YZ plane. And because this is getting narrow here, we want to do this one more time. We're going to actually make it the same shape, but in line with our bow point here. So let's copy that sketch, Control C, deselect everything, just select our hull sketch, our rib, Control V to paste it. Bring this into that body. It doesn't matter where you drag it. As long as it's within the body, it will just drop the sketch at the last point. Notice that you can't move these sketches. If you actually want to move the sequence of where something goes, you have to right-click on it and say Move Object after another object, and then you can select where that goes. This is a simple feature I wish FreeCAD had, is I could just drag this somewhere else in that body. But no, you can move it. You just have to right-click it and use this option here. We want to move the Z to 25, so that's the point here that we created, that little semicircle. Double click to edit that. Now we're going to make it really, really small. So let's get rid of this top line. Let's get rid of this right B-spline, and we're going to try to bring everything in. Let's see if I can highlight just these points. Doesn't let me drag them all at once. So I'm just going to bring everything in here like this. It might actually be easier to recreate. In fact, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to get rid of this spline. I'm going to trace something in here. So let's create a new B-spline. From this point out here, we're going to bring it in like so. Right click to end the B-spline, right click to end the tool. And we're going to make a horizontal constraint between these two like we've done before. Let's bring this down to line it up with our guide. Let's bring this out a little bit. We're going to bring this down. Same with this one. And let's hide that bow to make sure we got the shape looking about right. I'm just going to keep moving these around until I get a shape that I'm kind of happy with. You can kind of make the shape something else, but I find the loft works easier when the shapes are similar because it tries to interpolate between those shapes. So if you try to attach it to a different shape, you might find the loft tool does some really funky things. I think that looks good enough for what we need. Let's turn that bow back on. Everything lines up, good enough. Let's click on that B-spline. Let's use the mirror tool around the Z-axis. Let's use the line tool to connect this point to this point. Right click to end the tool. So now we have a fully enclosed shape. Close out of that. Let's turn our ribs back on. I'm going to turn this origin off, and this looks really good. Now we have manually created these ribs. Next, I'm going to click on the stern. So this is the first sketch of the loft. I'm going to hold Control. If you're on Mac, that's probably Command. And I'm going to click on the next sketches in order. Notice that this order absolutely matters. It will try to loft to these sketches. So if I tried to click, say, stern, then 2, then 4, then 1, then 3, it's going to actually try to loft between those, and it will be all sorts of wrong. In fact, I'll click on the Loft tool for you right now, and it can't even solve it. It's pretty gnarly. Let's go back to that, click cancel. So let's try stern, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's click the Loft tool. If you see an error like this, the command cannot be done. This is one of my complaints of FreeCAD. It does not give me very helpful error messages. So I have to figure out what's going on here. And I believe that means that one of these is not closed. So let's cancel out of the Loft tool. The easiest way to find this is to let's start going through here and finding if this is closed. So these points, yeah, that line is moving into that white line under there. So that looks closed there. I'll Control Z. Let's make sure that, these are not constrained. So let's constrain these points. So let's look at the front. These points are constrained to this Z-axis here. In fact, they should be on each other. Right click to exit. That looks good. Let's go to 01. Notice that these points are not constrained, or connected. So let's make sure they are connected because the Loft tool looks for connected sketches. They don't have to be constrained. They just need to be fully enclosed. So right click, say close. Let's check 02. These are not connected to each other, so I'm going to connect these like so. That looks like it's connected to that top line. That one, I'm not sure. Control Z to put it back where it was. Yeah, that is connected to the top line. You can see this is the top line here. This is that B-spline, so let's close out of that. Let's go to 03. Sure enough, those aren't connected, so C for the coincident constraint. Let's connect those. Check the top lines. Right-click to exit. That looks good. Let's go to 4. This is that really small one we have to zoom in for. And I'm going to guess that it's the same thing here. Yep, these are not connected. So let's connect them here. That's connected, and that red dot makes me think, oops. Let's zoom where we can see this, and we'll rotate. It does not like me rotating around that. Let's try to rotate around the center. There we go. Those look connected. So let's close, and we're going to try this again. So click on the stern, click on 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's try the Loft Tool much better. So if you see an error like that, it probably means that your sketches are not connected or fully closed. And that's how you solve it. You go through each one and you find where things are not closed. And to demonstrate the thing I wanted to show earlier, let's try clicking random sketches. And if we try that Loft Tool, it goes everywhere. It's trying to connect all those points and interpolate between those sketches in the order in which I clicked them. So cancel out of that. Let's go stern, then 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order from the back to the front of the boat. We'll click the Loft Tool. Remember that from the previous episode, ruled surface means that it creates straight lines between the sketches. Sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want nice curves like we have here. It should actually follow the curve of our guide decently well. If you really wanted to, you can add more ribbing to make it follow it exactly, and you can increase that resolution, but this looks really good. I'm pretty happy with this, so click OK, and we can hide these sketches. And you can see we have the hull of a boat here. Feel free to turn on the ribs so you can see how the loft followed those ribs. This is a demonstration of how you would manually create ribs, use the Loft tool to create a complex shape. Next, I want to show you how you can do it a little more easily using a third-party workbench. Before I show you this third-party workbench, let's go to File, Save As, and we're going to save this as boat_loft. From here, let's delete the loft, and we want to delete these intermediate cross-section steps. So everything we did here. So we are just left with our cross-section, this stern of the boat, and we are left with the guide rails along the X and Y, as well as the Y and Z planes, and this little bow point here. Go to Tools, Add-on Manager. Once that loads, it might take a moment. Search for Curve. There's two main workbenches here. The Curves workbench is really good for working with complex organic shapes. In fact, I'm going to show this in another episode. It is fairly advanced and it has a pretty steep learning curve. Once again, these are third-party workbenches that are not made by the original creators of FreeCAD. So take it all with a grain of salt. Some of these might be added as features into FreeCAD later, or some of them might be abandoned. So keep that in mind when you're working with these third-party workbenches. Next, we have the Curved Shapes workbench. This is really good for working with curved surfaces and specifically doing things like sweeps along guide rails that we want to do with this boat. I find it's not as advanced as the Curves workbench, but it is a lot easier to use. Let's click on Curved Shapes and click Install. Wait for that one while it installs, click OK, and close out of the Add-on Manager. Notice that it has you restart FreeCAD to take effect, so let's restart that. And I'm going to discard my changes because we saved it as a loft. Let's open up our boat loft. And as we did before, let's delete the loft and the 4 intermediate hulls. Let's bring back or show the guide rails that we want to work with. Let's go to the Curved Shapes workbench that we just installed. Notice that the tools change. There are 3 main tools that this workbench adds. The first is the Curved Array. This creates copies of a base sketch along guide rails, or what they call hull curves. This one's probably the simplest to use. There's the Curved Path Array, which copies a base sketch along a path, in other words, a sweep, and you can also define guide rails with this. I find this one a little more complicated, but it's good for complex sweep patterns. Then we have the Curved Segment tool. This interpolates between beginning and end shapes within guide rails. This allows us to transition from a separate stern shape, in our case, to the bow semicircle. It can be a little wonky. The interpolation takes some tinkering to get it to look right. Let's click on the curved array, since that one's the easiest one to use. So click on this. You can double click to bring it up to see the transform, but actually it wants us to work within the properties rather than giving us a task to use. So cancel out of that. The base is that object to make an array from. This is our first sketch. So we're going to click this. We're going to click the change, and we are going to click the stern. That's that back of the boat here. That should highlight for us here. Say OK. Then we want to define the hull curves. These are the guide rails. Click on this, and it allows us to select more than one. So we're going to do the X and Y, which is these set of curves here, and hold Control, click hull YZ to get that curve there. Say OK. And you'll notice that I get these lines here. What I should be seeing is this hull rib, this stern piece, copied as a shape that follows these guide rails. But this is really useful to know or to watch for, because this is an error that crops up all the time with this workbench. You just see these lines. That means it's not working properly. In my experience, what I've discovered is that it wants something like a closed shape, or something very similar to a closed shape, that we need a top guide rail. So it doesn't work well with one curve as a guide rail when we select multiple guide rails. So to fix that, I'm going to go to my YZ, and we're going to need to create a line that goes down the center of this boat. So double click, and we're going to create that secondary guide rail here. Let's just do a straight line. We're going to start with this top point, and we're going to go to the back of the boat. Feel free to attach it to these points. Right click, click close, and this should be fixed for us. Now we have these shapes that follow along these guide rails. Notice that it kind of tries its best. It's not quite meeting the guide rails. It's trying to do this really intelligent tool thing, but sometimes it's not the best. So to fix the resolution, I like to come down to the curved array, so make sure that's selected so we can look at the properties here and adjust these items. Notice that we can increase the number of points here. Something between like 30 and 50 is a really good starting point, and that gives us something that's a lot closer. Once again, it's not following this base exactly, so you need to come in and adjust your base as necessary to get this rail to look right, or this hull to look right. Otherwise, this gives us an approximate shape that's really good and fairly easy to use. Once we're happy with this design and how that shape's going to look, we want to turn this into a solid. The easiest way to do that is just to, in the curved array properties, find solid and change that to true. And now we have a nice solid. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the rest of my sketches, and we are good to go with this. I'm going to go ahead and save this, because there is a chance I'm about to crash FreeCAD, and you get to watch that. So I'm going to save this as boat curved shapes, so it's separate from my manual loft. I'm going to adjust it so I can see the boat hull here. And in an earlier episode, I mentioned that the thickness, or the shell tool, is not the strongest in FreeCAD. So I'm going to go back to Part Design Workbench. I'm going to click on Curved Array. I'm going to click Body. That hides the original. That creates a base feature that I can kind of work with here. I'm going to click that top, and I'm going to click Thickness. And I actually kind of expect FreeCAD to crash right about now. So this is a combination of tools that do not work well together in FreeCAD. As you can see, it has fully crashed, which means I need to exit the hard way, which go to your operating system and click Close, which on Windows is going to the Task Manager, finding it here, and absolutely killing it this way, and then restart FreeCAD. That is an unfortunate case of something not working well in FreeCAD. So let's start it up again and go into my boat curved shapes. So as I mentioned, the thickness tool does not work well, at least in this case when we've done this curved array. Hopefully that's something that's fixed in the future, but if we want to carve this out to make a nice shell, there's more than one way to do it. It's just that thickness tool is very nice when it does work. The easiest way I have found to do this is to go to the draft workbench. We're going to click on the curved array, and we're going to click that blue sheep icon to create a clone. Notice this is the draft workbench version of a clone. I'm then going to scale this, and this is after a bunch of trial and error because there's no real easy way I've found to scale it to create a particular thickness without using that thickness tool. And I will scale it to 0.85 or 85% in X, 92% in Z, and 87% in, 92% in Y, 87% in Z. And so that creates this nice cutout for us here. You can either use the measuring tool to try to determine the thickness. If the measuring tool doesn't work for you, something else I like to do is to create a temporary sketch. So we can create a new sketch. Let's go with, objects X and Y, something like this. You can draw, say, construction geometry between 2 points, say about here and here. And you can use something like the distance tool, and you can say, oh, that's 1.74 millimeters, that's good enough. And so that's how I did my trial and error, just by continuously measuring the thickness of this hull. So let's close out of that, and we can delete this sketch. That's if, say, the measuring tool does not work for you, which you can try here, and sometimes clicking on a point doesn't work super well. 1.47, that's still probably good enough. Oh, and that showed up over here. So sometimes that measuring tool isn't the best. So I like to use sketches to slice stuff and then measure it that way. But 1.47 is still fine for 3D printing. So let's close out of that tool. Now that we have two parts, we've got this smaller hull that's here and this larger hull that's the original one here. We want to cut these two. Notice that we're not in a body, so the part design workbench does not work very well for us. The easiest way to do this is with the part workbench, which is meant to do things like Boolean cuts. Let's click the first one, control click the second one, that's the one we want to cut out, and let's use the Boolean cut operation, and that should create a nice hollow shell for us. Feel free to save this design now that we have this. Notice that it's a separate body. If we want to bring this back into part design, we can click on this. We can create a new body, and that will bring it in as a base feature. Or you can create a body here, and you can drag that cut in as a base feature, and I'll hide everything else, and you can see it exists here. In theory, this should allow us to start creating sketches on this, and that allows us to start designing features on the boat. So I can do something like that, I can pad it up, and I can start actually designing on that object, and that is a new body that we can work with. So let me delete that pad, and let me delete that sketch. And this gives you a nice toy boat to work with, or print it as is. And in fact, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'll Control S to save. I'll click on that body, and I will export that. And let's bring that into the slicer to 3D print it. As we've done in previous episodes, I can then import this into my slicer. You can see it right here. I'm actually going to print this upside down, so the support material is on the inside of the boat. So let's flip this like this, 180 degrees, like so. Let's rotate it. Yep, there's that blue outline. I'm going to generate support. Let's try a grid. We'll slice it. That looks pretty good. And that looks like I can pull that out with some needle nose pliers. So I'm pretty happy with that. Feel free to try different versions of the support. Let's save this to disk and print it. This is a pretty fast print as the boat is small and hollow. With any luck, there won't be any holes and the boat will float. At this point, you should have all the basic building blocks for using FreeCAD to create nearly any single contiguous shape you can think of. There are obviously more features in other workbenches like draft, part, and curves. Feel free to dive into those if you want to build even more advanced solids, but I've shown you enough to get started with any beginner or intermediate modeling project. For your final single body challenge, I want you to design a propeller. These are notoriously difficult as they require creating curved or slanted shapes for the blades. You'll also need to use your knowledge of padding, revolving, and patterns. It doesn't have to look like mine. You can make a computer fan, boat propeller, or whatever you'd like, so long as it can move air when you spin it. There are a couple of pitfalls you should be aware of if you're using curved shapes, and like this curved array function, to create your blade. If you're trying to bring this curved array into a body made with part design, I find that the polar pattern doesn't work very well. So for example, let me turn this into a solid. So there's the blade I'm trying to create. I'm going to take this curved array and I'm going to drag it into the body here. And you notice it shows up front with this base feature. Now with the hull, that was a useful starting point, but it doesn't work when other features have already been created as part of that body. So I could try to move it after another object. That would be sketch 005. So scroll down, sketch 005, and it just disappears. It seems to be an interesting bug. So let's delete this, come back to our curved array. The other thing that I have found works decently well is you could fuse these into one body. So you could go to part, you can select both of these, create a fusion, apply, close that task. Let's come back to part design. If we create a body, drag that in there, now we get a base feature, and now we can work with this. With that, we could create a polar pattern, and it essentially replicates that whole body around the axis here, and that's fine. The whole thing just fuses together as one, so that creates part of the propeller, and we could change this to something like 4 blades, and we would be done. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is, let me delete this fusion operation. We've got the curved array here. The other way that I have found is to set body as the active body, click curved array. We're going to create a subshape binder, so let me hide that original one. So we have this subshape binder. And what's interesting is in part design, if I do the Boolean operation and I do fuse and I click OK, that now creates a solid feature out of that subshape binder, which is really slick. The problem is if I go to polar array, the whole thing just fails. Only additive and subtractive features can be transformed. Okay, well that's not fun. I can try to transform body instead of the tool shapes, and that looks like it does the entire body, which is kind of what we were doing earlier. And let's add 4 blades there and click OK. And as long as I'm around this Z-axis, and that's what I selected to create that array around, we are good. So note that when working with that curved array with the curved shapes workbench, it can be tricky to get it into a body with part design. If you'd like, feel free to add a hole here to take a 2mm shaft from something like a hobby motor, and you can see if it actually spins for you. If you're feeling ambitious, you can even try printing it and attaching it to a motor to see how well it moves air. Feel free to get creative with this project. We're not trying to perfectly engineer a propeller for a particular application. It's just CAD practice, and I want to encourage you to share a screenshot of your designs or 3D printed parts on X, Instagram, or LinkedIn. If you do share, please tag DigiKey and add the hashtag #DKFreeCAD. In the next episode, we'll create more advanced curved surfaces using the curves and part workbenches. See you then.